Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Very much appreciated. Please keep your comments coming. Had some nice comments from Hannah Whiskey Merchants. They obviously enjoyed what I had to say, and certainly didn't seem to upset anybody, which was really good. So of course, as per usual, any comments I do make in today's episode of the show are wholly my own and have no bearing or relevance to the company that employs me. Just to make that very, very clear. Shame that I have to do so, but yeah, that's the way of things. Anyway, so yeah, last week's episode of the show seemed to go down really well, and you know, a lot of people enjoyed it, so that's really cool. Hopefully you will enjoy today's episode of the show, and I thought it was time to go Irish again. I mean, obviously I did Waterford about 3 weeks ago or whatever it was, but I thought, yeah, let's do another episode of the show on Irish whiskey. And this week I'm looking at the range produced by J.J Corry. Although J.J Corry isn't the name of the producer, it's the name of the brand, I suppose, for want of a better word. And basically it all kind of began in sort of 2012. A lady called Louise McGuane, or McGuane. I can't quite figure out the pronunciation, so I do apologise if I've pronounced your name incorrectly. It wouldn't be the first time I've pronounced a name incorrectly, now would it? No. Anyway, so apparently she spent 20 odd years in the global drinks industry, working for the likes of Diageo, Moet and Pernod Ricard, and in 2012 decided to move back to her family's farm in Ireland with plans to start a distillery. I suppose if you spent 20 odd years working for faceless mega corporations, you probably want to do something with a little bit more of a human touch, don't you? Ooh, did I criticise Diageo? There's a first, isn't it? No, honestly. So basically, yeah. So she had this kind of desire, these plans to sort of create a distillery, and was doing the research and came across this label from what was known as a whiskey bonder called J.J Corry, who apparently just lived a few miles away from the family farm. And now, whiskey bonder, I don't know if the terminology is synonymous with Ireland, but essentially a whiskey bonder back in the sort of 1900s would purchase mature stocks, new make from the various distilleries in Ireland anyway, and then obviously create their own blends and sell them. I mean, this is nothing new. This is what the whiskey industry was built on. I mean, certainly in Scotland you had the likes of John Walker, Haig, those kind of people. They were doing exactly the same thing. They were purchasing the spirit from various distilleries and creating their own blends, and then obviously purchased the distilleries and etc. You know the score. So this isn't sort of anything particularly unusual. Although this J.J Corry chap seemed to be a bit of an interesting character. He apparently owned a shop in Kilrush and sold his Corry's Special Malt. Apparently the shop was obviously quite close to a port, and obviously imported and sold a number of weird and wonderful things such as wine, rum, port and bicycles, apparently, as you do. It was also invented a bicycle in the 1890s, which was apparently called the Gael, and hence the link to the name. So apparently J.J Corry died in 1932. The business was taken over by, I believe, his daughter, and eventually the shop and what have you was sold off in the 80s. So basically Louise decided that she was going to get into this bonding malarkey. It sounded like a good idea and probably a lot cheaper than building a distillery. So repurposed a barn on the family farm into essentially a warehouse for storing casks, and that is exactly what she decided to do. And in 2015 founded the company called the Chapelgate Irish Whiskey Company, and set about sort of obviously buying stocks, I assume both new make and mature stocks from various distilleries around Ireland. Obviously, I guess as we all go back to this kind of point where, you know, everybody's going, oh, well, they're just rebottling Cooley or they're rebottling whatever, you know, and we know that there's only a handful of distilleries back in the day, but it's all, as I've often said, not necessarily where you get your spirit from, it's what you do with it that counts, and you know, how good is the juice in the bottle at the end of the day, which obviously we will look to find out. So anyway, basing her range around this original J.J Corry label. Now, I don't think, although I don't know for definite, I don't think that what she's set out to do is recreate Corry's blend. I think she's basically taken the name as a brand name, for want of a better word, and is obviously creating her own blends and so on and so forth. I don't know whether the name was ever sort of you know, registered or what have you, or trademarked or anything like that. So I don't know whether that had to be purchased. I mean, it's a possibility, but anyway, I don't honestly know. But anyway, that's the background behind the brand J.J Corry, which, you know, I like a little bit of a story. I mean, it's always good fun, isn't it? It sort of beats the hell out of somebody just decided they were going to sort of set up their own bottling company, and well, that's what they called it. You know, it's always nice to have a bit of a back label, or back story, even if you have no kind of direct link. I mean, it's not like, say, for example, James Eady, when, you know, the descendants of James Eady decided to recreate the trademark X. I don't think this is what's happening in this instance, but it does kind of, I suppose, feed into, you know, giving a little bit of a historical kind of feel to the brand, and kind of, I suppose, cementing it within the sort of, like, you know, the Irish sort of tradition, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, okay, like I said, there's no obviously direct family connection between J.J Corry and Louise, but at the end of the day, I don't really think that matters particularly at the end of the day. I mean, she could have just set up the company herself and decided to sort of call it, you know, something completely different, and it's just a new sort of blended whiskey, or, you know, whiskey bonding company, if as the case may be. So so yeah, anyway, that's a little bit of the backstory to the brand, and obviously if you want to find out more information, there is a link to their website in the box below. So don't think there's an awful lot to say, apart from I've got kind of, it's a sort of a tale of two halves. There's sort of the J.J Corry, and there's something else as well. You've probably noticed from the title page that sort of two of the bottlings, the ones at the end, are called Fierfield. I think that's how you pronounce it, which is kind of a sort of not wholly to do. It's a kind of collaboration between J.J Corry and a chap called Mr. Lyon, whose real name is rather unpronounceable, Ryan Chitterwarden or something like that. Apparently he was the world's most awarded bartender, and had bars and cocktail bars and stuff like that in London and all over the place, and like I said, sort of has won inordinate amount of awards and what have you, and he's collaborated with J.J Corry on this little project. And apparently what they do is they first off cold distill bread, honey and butter, apparently. Obviously, you may well be familiar with the concept of cold distilling. Certainly the likes of the Worship Street cream gin is distilled sort of, because you can't heat up milk at the end of the day. It's just going to go rancid, isn't it? So they basically have to do the opposite. They basically boil it by, you know, freezing it to sort of very, very low temperatures, and so they do that. They then press heritage apples and reduce that with selected botanicals and blend it in to the bread, butter and honey distillation, and then they blend it with molten grain whiskies from J.J Corry. So that is where the sort of tie-in lies. So I thought it would, although they're technically two separate entities, I suppose, for want of a better word, I thought it would be nice to sort of taste the both of them together, and Axiom Brands, who are the the distributors of J.J Corry and Fierfield kindly sent me the samples, so a big thank you to them for the samples for today's episode of the show. And I thought, well, you know, it kind of fleshes it out to 6, doesn't it? So, so yeah, I thought I'd do it anyway. Not a lot else to say. I think I've said quite enough as it is. So we'll just take a look at today's lineup. As I said earlier, the second bottle that we're going to be looking at is called the Gael, after this bicycle that J.J Corry invented. But the first bottle we're going to be looking at is called the Hanson. This is batch number 2. This is what I kind of like about what they're doing, is that they're not trying to sort of keep everything the same. They're going, right, look, batch 1, batch 2, batch 3, and there's going to be nuances, one would imagine. And certainly when we get to the Flintlock, I have 2 batches of the Flintlock, so I'm kind of quite intrigued because I've not tasted them back to back, so it'd be interesting to see how they differ. But anyway, so this is batch number 2 of the Hanson, which is a blend of Irish grain whiskies. They are 4, 9 and 10 years old and all ex-bourbon aged, obviously non-chill filtered, bottled at 46%, as they should be, so kind of quite looking forward to that. Then we're looking at batch number 3 of the Gael, again bottled at 46%. It's a blend of 50% malt and 50% grain, and is selected from the casks they have in their warehouse. So 50% is a 4-year-old grain. 49.5% is a blend of 14 to 18-year-old single malts, and 0.5% is 29-year-old single malt sherry, ex-sherry butt. I'm assuming that the rest was all aged in American oak, so looking forward to that. Then we're moving on to batch number 2 of what they've called the Flintlock. This is a 14-year-old. Now apparently the Flintlock is named after a pistol that was discovered in the barn, I'm assuming the barn that they've repurposed into a bonded warehouse. And apparently the pistol dates back to the 1790s, so hence it appears on the label. And so, yep, nice little tie in there, kind of like that. So batch number 2 is, as far as I'm aware, 3 casks of single malt, all aged in American oak, aged between 14 and 18 years, possibly, and I don't know for definite, possibly married in ex-Muscatel casks, because that is what was done for batch number 3. Batch number 3 was a slightly bigger production, being 6 casks of single malt aged 15 to 19-year-old, so carries a 15-year-old age statement. And apparently, according to the information I was given, this was married in ex-Muscatel casks. So there's a possibility, and I guess we'll find out from when we taste the batch 2 as to whether that was indeed married in ex-Muscatel. Then we're going to move on to the 2 Fierfield bottlings. This is Birch, bottled at 42%, so obviously Birch being the main flavouring element of that. And the second one is called Barberry, also bottled at 42%, so guess what that would have been mainly flavoured with. Anyway, so yeah, I think there'll be 2 interesting ones to finish off on. I would like to see how much spirit character there is in those 2 bottlings, yeah, we shall see when we obviously get there. So let's kick off with a bit of grain whiskey then, shall we? Okay, so this is the Hanson batch number 2, bottled at 46%. Let's see what the nose gives us then, shall we? That's a nice nose. It's got crisp, grainy, almost wheaty kind of notes. It's a sort of a moderate sort of feeling of maturity. As we well know, grain whiskey takes an inordinate length of time to mature. So even though the oldest in this is 10 years old, it's still pretty young as far as a grain is concerned. There's a little bit of almost kind of peachy white fruit, some vanilla ice cream character. The oak is certainly giving it that kind of ice creamy kind of note. A little bit of lemon. Yeah, I mean that's a nice nose. That's a pleasant nose. For a relatively young grain, it's got a reasonable amount going on, and yeah, it's got it's got a pleasant balance to it. So yeah, nice nose. Sort of pass on. Nice length. It's kind of quite creamy to start off with. Again, I'm getting that sort of ice cream character. The grain is quite soft. It's quite wheaty. Doesn't quite have that sort of hard edge of some Scottish grain whiskies. There's a nice nip to it. I will give it that. A little bit of spiciness kind of coming through on the finish. The finish has got a good length. It's pretty long for a relatively young grain whiskey, and again, really quite nicely balanced. Like you kind of get a feeling of a subtle dried fruit kind of grain spirit note, which is kind of starting to sort of social maturity, along with the slightly more sort of youthful, but it's not too young, it's not spirity, and even though the youngest component is 4 years old, it's balanced. It works really quite nicely, I think. Obviously with grain I would like to see it sort of, with a bit more age, and no doubt in due course one imagines that that will change as the batches change, but for now, yeah, I mean, that's what, 40s, late 40s I guess, retailing. Yeah. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Gael batch 3. I'm probably pronouncing that completely wrong as well, but anyway, you know what I'm like. Let's see what the nose is like. That's quite a weighty nose. It's quite rich, quite fruity. Pineapple, apricot, vanilla, a touch of shortbread, peach. Ooh, just a smidgen of dried fruit. I mean, it's only 0.5% of the blend is old sherry, and it's you kind of blink and you miss it kind of thing. It's there, but it's a lovely whiskey. It's again really well balanced. Not too heavy on the oak. The oak is there. It's noticeable. It's sitting in the background. There's a little bit of spiciness. The grain is adding just a slight nip to the proceedings. It's wonderfully soft. It's full, aromatic, quite barley scented. So which it is kind of ticks all my boxes. It has to be said. So we'll pass one. Rich but delicate, full, elegant, fruity, silky, touch more oily, a touch more weight on the mid palate. Moves into a little bit of straw, certainly getting a note of dried fruit, dried cherried fruit on the finish. Again, not a huge amount, but it's just there, just adding a little bit of a nuance. Quite nutty, a little bit of menthol on the aftertaste. Lovely length, again, really nicely balanced. Predominantly sort of barley scented with fruit, straw, a little bit of nuts. Easy going, but got a fair degree of complexity. It has to be said. It's a kind of malt you need to just let unwind. When I say malt, a whiskey that needs to just unwind. It develops, it moves, it sort of progresses, which is the sort of thing that again really floats my boat. I don't want a whiskey to sort of deliver everything from the word go and have nothing behind it. This just unwinds really quite nicely. Getting a little bit of almost tropical fruit now on the aftertaste. I mean, that is, it's just kind of creeps up on you, the complexity. It's like I said, it's not a sort of a whiskey you kind of, I mean, you can just sort of like take a sort of a mouthful and just enjoy it and just sit back and not necessarily think about it. But when you do think about it, you realise that how it's unwinding, what it's giving you. And I think that's a really nice whiskey at the end of the day. So yeah, good stuff. Right, okay, so let's move on to batch number 2 of the Flintlock. This is 14 years old. Again, quite dense. It's got some obvious maturity, subtle dried fruits, apricot, pear, quince, barley, a little bit of honey, nice weight again to the nose, little biscuity note, a little bit of sawdusty oak, coconut. Again, there's a little nip from the younger spirit, although the younger spirit is 14, so it's got a really good weight to it, lovely oiliness, richness, but a slight floral character coming through now. Again, really good blend, really complex, and just really very enjoyable. Let's see what that's like. A lot more weight on the palate, heavier, oilier. Apricot, again, quince, almost marmalade-y kind of note, barley, malt, subservient oak. It's not, again, the oak is there, it's sitting in the background, it is adding a little bit of tannin just to give a little bit of structure, a little bit of spice, lemon, certainly lemon on the finish, a little bit of straw as well. You can taste the maturity in this particular bottling. I mean, it certainly sort of underpins everything else, and it's got a nice weight, and like I said, sort of a little bit of a floral note. Again, barley accented, American oak, no heavy oak. I'm guessing a lot of refill American oak casks used in here, and it's just a gorgeous whiskey. It's a lovely mouthfeel, full, and it just lingers and lingers. I mean, that is just a lovely Irish whiskey. Okay, so let's move on to batch 3. Let's see what nose gives us on this then, shall we? Right, well, that's quite considerably different to batch number 2. More freshness, more citric, more floral as well. Again, barley. I'm definitely getting some wininess coming through, so I didn't get quite so much of a wininess with batch number 2, so it's a possibility that wasn't married in Muscatel, or if it was, the Muscatel certainly didn't really kind of come through very much. On this, I'm definitely getting some sort of winey, honeyed kind of edgy notes. It feels like, although it's more citric initially, it kind of settles down to sort of show more oak. I'm getting more American oak, getting more vanilla. It's certainly some pollen notes coming through now, floral pollen notes, quite heavy. I mean, that's an impressive note. It's very different to batch number 3. I think it possibly shades batch number 2, I think, on the nose. I think there's a little bit more going on. There's a little bit more intensity, and it certainly changes. Like I said, it kind of opens up with this kind of fresh citric kind of character, and then settles down into this kind of slightly more heavier, weightier kind of more cask driven, shall we say. But I don't think that's a detriment to the nose whatsoever. It's just purely, I think, an observation. Let's see what the palate's like. Again, the palate is more cask driven, opens up with some creamier oak. Again, weightier, fuller than even though sort of batch number 2 had a nice weight to it. It feels heavier, it feels more weightier than that batch. Barley, sweet toffee. There's some maturity happening here, that sort of dried fruit maturity. But all the time you are kind of aware of this sort of slightly honeyed, grapey wininess that's sort of pervading the palate. Not to the detriment, I hasten to add. You can just tell it's there. and like I said, this batch number 3 does seem to sort of be a little bit more oak centric, but it's lovely and silky and smooth and soft, with a sort of a nip at the end. It has to be said, there's a gentle spicy nip. I mean, again, it's a very, very good blend. Certainly Louise has put together an absolutely gorgeous blend in my personal opinion, and it's just really nice to see that there is a big difference between batches. I mean, you know, you could argue that if you're going to sort of create something very, very samey, what's the point of calling it a batch number 3 if it's not going to sort of be obviously noticeably different? And certainly batch number 3 is very different to batch number 2. And you're going to get people that will prefer one or t'other at the end of the day. I'm kind of torn, I suppose. I think I'm edging towards batch number 3, but that's not to say batch number 2 is bad. I just think I like a little bit more oak. But, you know, they're both exceptionally good. That's all I'm saying. Right, okay, so let's move on to the first of the 2 Fierfield bottlings. This is the Birch. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Bit of an odd nose, I guess. Well, no, that's not strictly true. It's biscuity. It's kind of birch sap. It's got a kind of an almost Madeira-like note. It certainly kind of feels more like a fortified wine than a spirit, and maybe that's what they were kind of aiming for with this. I don't get a lot of whiskey character. I get the feeling of fortification. So it's waxy, it's honeyed, it's interesting. But yeah, it does feel very, very much like a sort of a Madeira, or possibly a sort of I wouldn't quite go as far as saying a Manzanilla sherry, because it's not obviously got quite the saltiness that I would get with a Manzanilla. Yeah, Madeira I think is probably quite close. I mean, it's interesting. Not, like I said, getting an awful lot of spirit character, but interesting. Let's see what pass on. Waxy honey, burnt biscuits, bit of herbal notes. Again, Madeira kind of just comes to mind. It is very Madeira-like. Has that kind of biscuity, kind of winey, honey, almost grapiness, but not getting quite the sort of Madeira dried grape character, because obviously there's no Madeira or dried grape at all in this. Very sappy, very kind of oily finish. Again, I'm not getting any real spirit whiskey character. It's kind of almost there as a sort of, like I said, to just fortify the sort of base character. I don't get any sort of bread, butter or any of that kind of stuff. I mean, it's got a nice mouthfeel. It's interesting. I don't know quite what you would do with it. I suppose, well, stupid thing to say, you'd probably drink it, but you know what I meant was, what would you do with it? Would you use it as a base, as a cocktail? Would you put things with it? I haven't got a clue. It's an interesting one, I think. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Barberry. So obviously we'll see what the nose gives us on this then. Quite syrupy, kind of tawny port-like, damson, prune, spice, dusty spice. Obviously, I mean, I'm not the world's greatest expert on berries, it has to be said, but it has a sort of a dried kind of berried note. But I mean, if you told me this was Barberry, I would have said, "Ooh, is it really?" Because it does come across as a sort of a tawny, kind of porty, sort of Moscatelli kind of nose. And again, it's interesting. Not quite sure what you would do with it, apart from the obvious. Yeah, it's got a nice herbal note coming through. Interesting, I think, is today's word on this. Let's see what those give. Palate gives. Syrupy, berried, porty, sort of dried fruit. Again, pretty much like the other one, like the Birch. No kind of whiskey character. It's just kind of almost like a fortifying spirit. Reasonably balanced. I mean, it's a bit sweet on the finish, a little bit cloying. Not really my kind of cup of tea. Slightly botanical. It's not sort of, you know, making me want to go, oh my god, this is great things in sliced bread. It's okay. It is what it is at the end of the day. I'm sure there's some people that absolutely love this kind of stuff. But for me, you know, it's a case of, well, I'd quite happily have a Madeira or a port or a sherry. You know, it's pretty much kind of aping those kind of things, I suppose. And you know, I'm not going to knock the quality of it. The quality is very, very good. It's very drinkable, and if you like this kind of stuff, then you know you're going to kind of love this. For me, like I said, it's just sort of, you know, not kind of like, you know, not enough whiskey character. You know, if you're going to make something with using sort of, I mean, I can't imagine they're using sort of extremely mature spirit in this somehow. I don't know what it retails for, but you know, it's obviously going to be using younger spirit because it's not really there for the spirit character. It's there to basically add some alcohol at the end of the day. Although, you know, you can argue that, well, you could use any old bloody alcohol. Well, you could, but the point being is if you're going to use sort of like, you know, cheap, nasty bloody alcohol, it's going to come across as a cheap and nasty product, isn't it? So, you're going to use a quality product, and you know you can't argue it's a quality product. So it's just obviously, you know, it's probably got a very sort of like very, very small market, I should say. But anyway, it is what it is, and a different way of ending an episode of the show, shall we say. Right, okay, so firstly a big thank you to J.J Corry and to Axiom Brands for the samples for today's episode of the show. I hope this has not been a disappointing review. I hope it's been one of my usuals, shall we say. And you know, the Hanson, I like that. I like that a lot. I mean, it's a good grain whiskey. It's young, yes, not too young. It's got a nice balance to it. And yeah, I like that. It's got enough complexity to sort of say, interest there, shall we say. The Gael, again, another lovely bottling. I thought that was really well put together. Nicely balanced. I must admit, I think in this instance I would say I would like to have seen a little bit more of that mature sherry, but then we're pushing the price up, aren't we? You know, 29-year-old sherried Irish whiskey ain't gonna come cheap, is it? So there was a nuance there, and I think if you didn't know it was there, you'd probably miss it. But in saying that, again, I think it was a lovely blend. The batch 2 of the Flintlock, that was a nice whiskey. It was more possibly about the spirit than the oak. It had a nice weight to it. It was an interesting sort of and a really pleasant overall whiskey, I would have to say. I think possibly batch 3 shaded it, maybe because it had a little bit more oak character. But again, really nicely balanced, well put together, and again, it just goes to show you how you know, batch variation, which is obviously a deliberate thing in this instance. It's not trying to recreate batch 2. I've obviously not tasted batch 1, so I couldn't comment on batch 1, but there's an obvious difference between batch 2 and 3. I suppose from a kind of a retailer's point of view, unless you've tasted them, it's always difficult because, you know, a customer sort of says, I really love batch 1 of whatever, you know, here's batch number 2, but I didn't really like that so much. You know, and the point being is that sort of, you know, it's, you have to kind of, I suppose, make as a retailer, customers aware of the potentiality of batch variation, and unless you've actually tasted it, how are you going to tell them that it's going to be different from the previous batch? And this is always a kind of a conundrum, certainly for, shall we say, shops that don't actually taste before they purchase, shall we say. Oh, get the knife into the whiskey shop. Oh, did I say that? I didn't mean that at all. But you kind of, this is why I kind of, you know, if I'm sticking my retailer's hat on, I always ask for samples, because I want to know what the hell I'm dealing with. You know, just because you tell me it's batch number 2 of whatever doesn't necessarily mean that I can sell it. Yeah, because customers are going to ask, well, how does it compare to batch number 1? And if I've never tasted either of them, you know, I'm going to go, well, according to the blurb, well, you know, that ain't going to happen. You know, at the end of the day, it's kind of, you want me to stock your whiskey, and you know, it might well sound like I'm bigging myself up and all this kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, there I have parameters. You know, I have my kind of, you know, my reasoning, and you know, it's, yeah, I'm not saying that, you know, but yeah, but the point is, you know, if I get behind it, I get behind it at the end of the day. And I'm kind of starting to waffle here, so I'm going to kind of move on. Anyway, on to the 2 Fierfield bottlings. So yeah, kind of Birch. Well, yeah, it's sort of, it was interesting. Barberry, kind of interesting. If it's your kind of thing, then absolutely fine. Not totally my kind of cup of tea, but you know, the quality was obviously pretty good. And when you sort of like look into the sort of the production methods, it's kind of quite a unique product, I suppose, at the end of the day. And well, anyway, there you go. That's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope I've not bored you too much with waffle. Until next time, all that's left to say is good afternoon and good dramming.